The wind off the ridge still smelled the same, after all these years, sage and cold stone, and something faintly sweet underneath, like the breath of the mountain itself. She stood before the weathered wooden door built into the hillside, her hand resting against its gray, sun-cracked boards, and felt the old ache rise in her chest, the one that came whenever she remembered how young she'd been, how frightened, how certain the land would break them before they ever had a chance to break it first. Beside her, tall and dark-haired and impatient in the way of the young, her granddaughter waited with her arms crossed against the morning chill. "You always stop here," the girl said. "Every time we walk up from the creek, you touch the door and you go quiet and you never tell me why." The old woman's mouth curved, though her eyes stayed fixed on the wood, on the iron hinge her husband's hands had shaped at the forge so long ago. "Because it isn't a door you tell about quickly," she said. "It's a door you have to walk into, the way we did. Then walk me into it." The wind gusted, rattling the dry cottonwood leaves, somewhere unseen behind the hillside, and the old woman allowed herself a long breath, the kind that reached all the way back to another autumn, another version of herself, 25 years old, hands raw from breaking sod, married only 2 years to a man who worked like the devil was chasing him, and prayed like God was listening close. "It was the autumn of 1888, she began. "Your grandfather and I had a claim not far from here, at the edge of Raven Creek, and it was drying up beneath us. Not all at once. Slow, the way real trouble comes. The well we dug ran low by August. The creek itself thinned to a trickle by September. We had cattle to water, and a garden struggling for its life, and no money to speak of, and pride enough between the two of us to keep trying anyway instead of admitting how frightened we were." She paused, and the granddaughter, sensing the weight settling into the story, went still. "We spent whole days searching these hills for water we never found. Caleb had a notion there might be a spring buried somewhere in the limestone, if we could only find where it surfaced. So we went out with lanterns and a coil of rope, more hope than sense if I'm honest, into country neither of us had any business wandering alone." "Is that when you found the cave?" "That's when we found the cave." The old woman's fingers pressed once more against the door, as though she could still feel the cold draft that had first drawn them forward. 40 feet into darkness, neither of them understood yet. But finding it was the easy part, child. What came after, that's the part worth telling. She turned from the door at last, facing the girl fully, her voice dropping into the low, steady rhythm of memory. "Sit with me a while. I'll tell it the way it happened." The girl settled onto the worn bench beside her grandmother, tucking her skirts beneath her the way she'd been taught, and waited. "It was the autumn of '88, the old woman began, and by then we'd been on that claim near 3 years. Long enough to know the land wasn't going to be generous with us. The well Caleb dug that first spring had gone dry by summer, and the corn we'd planted stood no taller than your knee, yellowed at the tips like it was already giving up before the frost could finish it." She smoothed her apron over her lap, though there was nothing there to smooth. "We were young enough still to believe stubbornness could stand in for rain. I see now how foolish that was, but pride doesn't listen to sense when you're 25 and afraid of admitting defeat." She let a silence sit there, the kind that had weight to it. Caleb wouldn't speak of leaving, not once. But I'd catch him standing at the edge of the field some evenings, just looking, like he was trying to argue with the ground itself. We didn't fight, not the way some couples might have. We went quiet instead. That's worse, I think, in its own way. A house can hold a lot of silence before it starts to feel like something's cracking. "Did you think about leaving?" the girl asked softly. "I thought about it more than I ever told him," Ada admitted. But I never said the words aloud, because I think I was afraid that saying them would make them true. So instead, I dug in. We both did. We told ourselves if we could only find water, a real spring, not just a wish, we could hold on through another season. Caleb had heard talk from an old prospector passing through Raven Creek, something about limestone holding water where you'd least expect it, hidden under the hills if a body knew how to look. She turned her gaze toward the hills beyond the doorway, though her eyes seemed to be looking somewhere much further than that, into another year entirely. So we packed what little we could carry, 2 lanterns, a coil of rope, a canteen half full, and we walked out past the fence line into country we barely knew. I remember the wind that day, dry and sharp, carrying the smell of dust instead of rain. Caleb didn't say much. Neither did I. We just walked, the two of us, side by side, searching the rock faces for any sign of seepage, any green where there shouldn't have been green. Her voice grew quieter, almost reverent. I remember thinking, if this doesn't work, I don't know what we do next. I don't know if there is a next. She paused, drawing a slow breath, as though gathering courage to step once more into that memory. We'd nearly given up for the day when Caleb stopped walking. Just stopped, still as stone, staring at a shadow in the rock ahead of us that didn't look like any shadow ought to. Ada? The girl at her side leaned closer, as if the old woman's silence might swallow the rest of the tale before it could be told. What was it? What did he see? The old woman's hands, folded in her lap, tightened around the worn edge of her shawl. A mouth in the hillside, she said. Not much of one, just a black gap in the limestone, half hidden behind a curtain of dead brush, the kind of place you'd walk past 100 times and never think twice. But Caleb had an eye for rock. He'd worked a quarry back east, before we married, and he always said stone had a way of telling you where it hid its secrets, if you knew how to listen. She smiled faintly. I teased him something terrible about that, called him a dowser of dirt, more than water. But that day, I wasn't laughing. That day, I just watched his face go still, the way it did when he was certain of something. She shifted in her chair, the old boards of the porch creaking beneath her like the years themselves settling. We cleared the brush with our hands, careful of thorns, and found the cave went back further than either of us expected, dry-walled with age, floor scattered with old bat droppings and the bones of some creature that hadn't survived a long-ago winter. It smelled of cold stone and dust, that particular smell caves have, like the earth holding its breath. She paused. We lit a lantern and went in, Caleb ahead of me, rope looped over his shoulder in case the ground gave way beneath us. I remember pressing my hand to the wall as we walked, feeling how the rock grew smoother, colder, the deeper we went. And then, the granddaughter urged, though she already knew, had heard fragments of this story her whole life, but wanted, needed, to hear it told properly, the way her grandmother alone could tell it. And then, near the back, where the cave seemed to end in solid rock, Caleb stopped again, set his palm flat against the stone and went quiet. Ada's voice dropped, as if she were once more standing in that hollow dark. There was a crack there, narrow as a hand's width, running floor to ceiling. And air was moving through it, cold air, steady as breath, smelling faintly of green things growing, though there wasn't a blade of grass for miles above ground. She looked down at her own hands, remembering how they had trembled. Caleb turned to me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in months. Not desperation. Hope, he said. Ada, there's something on the other side of this rock, and God help me, I believed him. We didn't go through that first day, Ada said, and her granddaughter's face fell just slightly, the way it always did when the story slowed instead of surged. Your grandfather wasn't a reckless man. Whatever else you've heard of him, know that. He measured the crack with his hands, walked its length twice, put his ear to it like he was listening for something breathing on the other side. Then he took my hand, and we walked back out into the daylight, and neither of us said a word the whole way home. She paused, and the wind moved through the mouth of the cave behind them, stirring something in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. That night, we sat at the table with one candle burning, and I told him I was afraid. Not of the dark. I'd never minded the dark, but of what it meant to go somewhere no one could pull us out of if the rock decided to close up behind us. We had no one to send for, no neighbor near enough to hear a shout. If something happened in there, it would just be the two of us, and whatever we could manage with our own two hands. "But you went anyway," her granddaughter said. "Not that night. Not even the next morning. It took 3 days of turning it over, Caleb sketching the wall from memory on the back of a flour sack, me lying awake, counting the ways it could go wrong. But on the 4th morning, he came in from the barn, with the good rope coiled over his arm and 2 lanterns filled and trimmed, and he set them on the table like he was setting down an answer to a question I hadn't quite finished asking." Ada smiled faintly, her eyes somewhere far off in the canyon light. He said, "We'll tie off at the entrance. I'll go first. If the air keeps moving the way it has, there's some place for it to go, Ada. Some place with room enough to breathe." And I remember thinking, we had already lost so much that year. The wheat, half the cattle, nearly the roof over our heads. What was one more risk, if it might be the one that finally paid us back? She looked down at the granddaughter's hands, so like her own once were. So I laced my boots tight, and he looped the rope twice around my waist and once around his own, and we walked back up that hillside with the lanterns swinging between us, neither one of us speaking, both of us thinking the same thought without saying it aloud, that we were about to do something there was no undoing. The old woman's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the journal in her lap. We stood at that crack in the rock, lanterns lit, rope taut between us, and Caleb turned to me one last time, not to ask if I was ready. He already knew the answer. He asked instead if I trusted him enough to go into the dark, not knowing what waited at the other end. I told him I trusted him more than I trusted my own 2 feet on solid ground, the old woman said, and a small, private smile crossed her face, the kind that belonged only to the memory and not to the room she sat in now. And that was true. It had to be true. There wasn't room in that crack for a woman who doubted. She drew a slow breath, as if the telling itself required air the way the crawling once had. He went first. Lantern held out ahead of him, his shoulders turned sideways because there was no way through square on. I heard the rock scrape his coat, heard him grunt when his boot caught on something below, and then his voice came back to me, muffled, saying it opened up a little further on, just enough to breathe easier, so I followed. Her hand moved unconsciously to her own shoulder, as though she could still feel the stone pressing there. The rope kept us tied close, but it didn't make the going gentle. My skirt caught twice, and I had to stop and free it with fingers that didn't want to work properly in that cold. The lantern light showed me nothing but rock on either side, so close I could feel it against both arms at once, and behind me the crack we'd come through had already swallowed the last gray daylight. There is a particular kind of dark down in the earth, child, not like nighttime, which still has stars in it somewhere. This dark had no bottom to it. She paused, and the granddaughter leaned in, though she said nothing, only waited. I remember counting my breaths instead of the distance, because the distance frightened me more. 10 feet, 20. My knees were raw through my skirts, and once I thought I heard something skitter away in the dark ahead of Caleb's lantern, though he never mentioned it, and I never asked. The air kept moving past us the whole while, cold and steady, like a hand pulling us forward by the collar. I remember thinking that if it stopped, if that wind ever went still, I would know we'd made some terrible mistake. Her voice dropped lower, the way it always did when she came near the heart of the telling. Caleb called back that the walls were opening. I didn't believe him at first. I thought it was only hope talking, the kind that comes when a body's desperate for good news, but then my own hands found nothing where rock should have been, and the air changed, grew warmer somehow, and carried a smell I hadn't caught in that tunnel. Green, growing, alive. I came up onto my knees behind him, and he had gone still as a stone himself, lantern raised, not saying a single word. She looked at her granddaughter now, eyes bright with something that had never quite left her, all these years later. I got up beside him, brushed the dust from my eyes, and looked past that lantern light into a place I still don't rightly have the words for, not after all this time telling it. "There's no words for it," she said again, softer, as if telling herself rather than the girl beside her. "But I'll try, because you asked, and because someone will have to carry this after me the way I carried it after him." She folded her hands in her lap, and for a moment the wind at the cave mouth seemed to hush along with her. Above us, far above, higher than any barn roof you've ever stood under, the rock had given way sometime long before we ever crawled in there. A great opening, ragged at the edges, letting the sky itself pour down into that black tunnel place. Sunlight came through it like water through a broken dam, gold and thick, falling all the way down to a pool below, so clear I could see stones resting at the bottom of it as if they were sitting in a wash basin on a kitchen table. She shook her head slowly, still half in disbelief though she'd told this part 100 times. "We had come from a summer that took everything from us, child. The creek gone to a trickle, the garden burned brown by August, and here in the middle of dry stone hills, there was grass, real grass, green as anything I'd seen back home before we ever came west. Berry bushes heavy with fruit nobody had planted, ferns taller than your knee, growing thick along the damp edges of that pool, and trees, cottonwoods if you can believe it, standing tall beneath that broken ceiling, reaching up toward the light like they'd been waiting years for somebody to come find them." Her granddaughter said nothing, only watched her, the way she always did at this part of the story, as though she could see it too if she looked hard enough into the dark behind her grandmother's eyes. Caleb didn't move for the longest while. I don't think either of us trusted our own sense. We had just crawled 40 feet through rock so tight I'd scraped my knuckles raw, expecting nothing more than another blind hollow, another disappointment to carry home with us. And instead we were standing at the edge of something that oughtn't exist at all, not in that country, not in that year, not after everything the land had already refused to give us. She drew a slow breath, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone quiet in that way it did when the wonder of it still outweighed the years between. "I remember thinking, foolish as it sounds, that we'd stumbled into someone else's mercy, that the ground had kept a secret just for us, waiting on the right kind of desperate hands to come looking." She turned her face toward the cave's dark mouth, as if she might see that first golden light again if she looked long enough. And then Caleb took a step forward, careful, like a man walking into church for the first time in years, and he said— She paused there, letting the hush stretch, the way she always did before the next part came. "Someone has been here before us. Just that. Not a shout, not surprise even, but a kind of quiet reverence, the words falling soft as ash between us. I didn't understand what he meant until I followed his gaze past the pool, past the ferns bowing low with the weight of collected dew, to the far wall of that impossible chamber. There, tucked beneath an overhang of pale stone, stood a cabin no bigger than a chicken coop, its walls built of the same limestone that surrounded it, so that it seemed to grow up out of the ground, rather than having been placed there by human hands. We crossed to it slow, the way you'd approach a sleeping animal you weren't sure would wake gentle or fierce. The door had rotted at its hinges and hung open, inviting and mournful both. Inside, dust lay thick over a single chair, a cold hearth no wider than a wash-basin, and a shelf holding what I first took for a Bible. It was not a Bible. It was a journal, its leather cover cracked and pale with age, the pages inside gone brittle as dried corn husk. Caleb lifted it like it might crumble in his hands, and for a long moment neither of us breathed as he opened it to the first page. The hand that had written those words was careful, patient. A farmer's hand used to counting seasons rather than years. Whoever they'd been, they had found this place decades before us, and had known exactly what it was worth. They wrote of the cavern's strange warmth even through winter, how the walls held heat like a stove banked low, how they'd coaxed tomatoes and beans to grow long after the frost had killed everything above ground. A greenhouse, hidden beneath the mountain itself, tended by someone who understood that the earth sometimes kept blessings folded inside its most unlikely pockets. Near the back of the journal, tucked between pages gone soft with handling, we found a map. Rough, hand-drawn, ink faded to the color of weak tea, but unmistakable in its purpose. Lines marking passages beyond the one we'd already crawled through, branching deeper into the ridge like veins beneath skin. Whoever had drawn it had marked certain spots with small crosses, and beside one, in handwriting grown shakier than the rest, were 3 words that stopped my heart clean. Leads to daylight. Caleb looked up at me then, and I saw in his face the same thing rising in my own chest, not just wonder now, but the dawning shape of possibility, vast and unproven, waiting to be tested. "There's more here than we've found yet," he said, and closed the journal gentle as closing a door on a room you intend to return to. We climbed back through the crack that evening, the rope trailing behind us like something we didn't quite trust to leave slack, and when we came out into the ordinary dusk of the rocky hillside, the whole discovery sat strange in my chest, too large to carry easily and too precious to set down. Neither of us spoke much on the walk home. The mule seemed to sense our silence and matched it, plodding along under a sky gone the color of a bruise healing. It wasn't until we'd eaten our supper, cold biscuits, a little salt pork, nothing that mattered, that Caleb finally said what I'd been turning over myself. "We could tell no one," he said. "Keep it as ours. Grow what we need, quiet, and let the rest of Raven Creek go on wondering how we manage." I understood the pull of it. We had scraped through 2 winters already thin as fence wire, watched other families lose their gardens to hail and their hopes to drought, and here was a gift that could ease our own hunger without a soul knowing to ask us for a share of it. There was a shame in that thought, but there was sense in it too, and I have never believed a woman ought to pretend she doesn't feel both at once. But I kept thinking of Widow Halverson down the road, whose potatoes had rotted in the ground that August, and of the Petersons with their 4 children and a well gone half dry. I thought of how quick suspicion turns to resentment out here, how a family seen thriving while others starved could find itself friendless, or worse, could find its secret pried open by someone less careful with the mountain than we'd been. If it got out on its own, I said slowly, found instead of given, that's worse. Folks forgive a shared blessing sooner than a hidden one. Caleb didn't answer right away. He turned the journal over in his hands, thumb tracing the cracked leather like he might read some answer written in its wear. And if we open it up, he said, we don't know what comes crawling in after. Men who see profit before neighbors. Men who don't care whose cabin sits at the far end of it. That fear wasn't foolish. I'd heard enough stories of claims jumped and springs fought over to know a valley like ours, spring-fed and fertile under solid rock, could turn covetous men reckless. We sat with that a long while, the fire popping low, both of us caught between two griefs, the fear of greed and the deeper, quieter fear of choosing selfishness and living inside it. I remember looking at Caleb's face in the firelight and thinking how tired he looked, how the weight of every hard season had settled into the lines around his eyes, and how much I wanted, just once, for something good to belong only to us. But even as I thought it, I knew we hadn't yet decided anything. We only knew we couldn't decide tonight. Morning came the way it always did that autumn, pale and slow over the ridge, and neither of us spoke of the valley until the coffee was near gone. It was Caleb who broke first, setting his cup down with a quiet finality I'd come to know well. We won't sell it, he said, and we won't hide it neither. We'll tend it, like it's ours to keep and ours to give from, both at once. I didn't answer with words. I only nodded, because something in my chest had already agreed before he finished speaking. We didn't rush the deciding into doing, not that week nor the next. But by the time the first hard frost silvered the fields outside, we'd carried our tools through the crack more times than I could count. Shovels, a hand auger, coils of old rope worn soft from use. Caleb dug the first channel himself, tracing a line from the spring's edge toward the patches of grass, letting gravity do the labor gravity was made for. I followed behind with a hoe, breaking the soil into rows, my hands blistered but steady. We planted what we could spare, potato eyes saved back, bean seed from the bottom of a nearly empty sack, cuttings from the chokecherry bush behind our own cabin, pressed into the cavern soil with a prayer more than a certainty. The cold air that once frightened Caleb into imagining some vast, unseen chamber now felt like a blessing itself, steady and mild, holding the valley at a gentleness the world above never offered. The stone cabin took longer to mend than the garden did to grow. We packed fresh mud into the gaps between stones, replaced a rotted sill, swept years of leaves and small drifted dust from its floor, until the little hearth inside looked almost ready for a fire again. Caleb built a new door for it from scrap plank, hung crooked at first, straightened after his third try, laughing under his breath at his own stubbornness. And at the mouth of the crack itself, where cold wind had first drawn us forward into the dark, Caleb built another door, smaller, sturdier, fitted tight enough to keep out curious animals and careless wanderers alike. He set a simple wooden latch on the inside, nothing grand, but enough to make the valley feel like something we were keeping safe, rather than merely keeping secret. Some evenings, standing at the pool's edge with lantern light trembling gold across the water, I'd watch Caleb work and think of the settler whose bones we never found, whose hands had shaped that first small cabin long before ours ever touched the stone. I wondered what dream had driven him under the mountain, and whether he'd ever imagined two more dreamers would follow, decades later, choosing not to hide his gift, but to grow it. My granddaughter shifted beside me on the cool stone, pulling her shawl tighter, though the air in the valley never bit the way the wind did outside. "You said there were other passages," she reminded me, tapping the journal's worn leather cover where it lay across my knees. I nodded, remembering how the map inside had haunted Caleb more than he ever let on. It was late in that same autumn, after the irrigation channels had begun carrying spring water to the first rows of turned earth, that Caleb unrolled the settler's hand-drawn map again by lamplight and traced a line none of the other paths matched. "This one goes somewhere," he said, and I knew by the set of his jaw there'd be no talking him out of following it. We went 2 days later, lanterns freshly filled, rope coiled at Caleb's shoulder. The passage the map marked ran narrow and low from the valley's western wall, nothing like the crack that had first drawn us in. This one climbed instead of dropping, twisting upward through cold stone that smelled of iron and old rain. I remember pressing my palm flat against the rock more than once, steadying myself, telling my own fear to hush. For nearly an hour we climbed, ducking beneath low shelves, squeezing past places where Caleb had to turn sideways and exhale to pass. Then, ahead, a gray thread of daylight appeared, thin as a stitch in dark cloth, growing wider as we pushed toward it. We came out onto a bare slope on the far side of the ridge, wind sharp and unfamiliar after the valley's gentleness, and below us, cutting pale through scrub and rock, ran a wagon road neither of us had ever set foot on. Caleb went still beside me, staring down at those wheel ruts as though he couldn't quite believe them. "That's the stagecoach road," he said finally, "the one that runs past Willow Bend." His voice carried a wonder I hadn't heard in him since the day we'd first seen sunlight falling through the cavern's broken ceiling. I understood then what he already had begun turning over in his mind, that the mountain we'd thought only concealed a garden had, all along, concealed a door between two roads, two worlds, folks who might otherwise ride half a day around rock and ravine to reach town. We stood a long while on that slope, wind pulling at our coats, saying little, both of us doing the same quiet arithmetic. A shortcut, a passage, something more than shelter, more than soil and water, a way for Raven Creek to reach beyond itself, and for the world beyond to reach back. Neither of us spoke of it as anything grand that evening, walking home through the dark valley with lanterns swinging low. But something had shifted between us, same as the mountain itself had shifted, opening onto a future neither of us had thought to hope for. The winter that followed was the hardest Raven Creek had seen in years, or so the old-timers said, shaking their heads over frozen wells and cattle lost to drifts higher than a man's shoulder. I remember it different than they do, though. I remember it as the winter our root cellar in the hidden valley never once ran empty, when the spring kept flowing warm enough that ice never touched it, and green things kept growing under that broken circle of sky like the mountain itself had decided to keep faith with us. We brought baskets up through the crack near every week that season, potatoes, carrots, the last of the squash, jars of berries put up in syrup. Caleb rigged a sledge to haul the heavier loads through the passage, and I recall the look on the Hendricks woman's face the first time we set a crate of fresh greens on her porch in the dead of January, like she'd been handed a piece of summer she'd given up on ever seeing again. Word spread quiet at first, then not quiet at all. Folks who'd looked at us sideways for years, wondering what strange thing kept us so occupied on our claim, started looking at us different. Grateful mostly. Some ashamed, I think, for the doubting they'd done. By spring, the shortcut through the mountain had become its own kind of miracle to the town, though a plainer one, wagons and riders cutting hours off the road to Willow Bend, stopping to rest and water their stock at the spring we'd widened just inside the far opening. Caleb built a lean-to there before summer, nothing fancy, just posts and a roof and a bench, but travelers took to calling it a blessing all the same. I'd hear them say so, passing through, not knowing we were the ones who'd found the crack that made it possible. There were harder days mixed in, of course. A fever that took hold of half the settlement one spring, a fence line we lost to a flood we hadn't planned for. Caleb near broke his wrist repairing the cabin roof after a fall of loose stone. But even those troubles felt different now, borne up by something steadier beneath us, the way a tree stands easier once its roots have found water. We were no longer just holding on, we were building something folks could lean against. I think that was when I understood what Caleb had seen on that ridge, wind pulling at his coat, staring down at wheel ruts worn deep by other people's journeys, not just a passage through rock. A passage toward belonging, ours and Raven Creek's both, mended together in ways neither of us could have drawn a map for, not even with the old settler's journal spread open between us. The wind had shifted while she talked, cooler now, carrying the smell of dust settling after a dry afternoon. She realized she'd been quiet a long moment, just looking at the wooden door set into the rock, its hinges dark with age and oiling, and her granddaughter hadn't rushed her. That was a kindness in itself, learned somewhere, maybe from watching her own mother wait out silences at the supper table. "So, that's the whole of it," she said, though she knew it wasn't, not really. A life didn't fold into an afternoon's telling, but the bones of it were there. She reached into the bag beside her, the leather worn soft as cloth, and drew out the journal. It had grown thick over the years, swollen with pages she and Caleb had added, sketches of the garden rows, tallies of harvests carried out to Raven Creek in hard winters, a pressed cottonwood leaf gone brittle and gold, even a few lines in a hand she recognized as her own from a night she could no longer place, something about starlight falling through the ceiling, crack onto frost-covered ferns. "He drew the second passage in himself," she said, thumbing near the back. "Badly. I always told him so, but it got us there, didn't it?" Her granddaughter took the journal carefully, the way one might take something alive, and opened it partway, studying the mix of hands, the stranger's faded ink from decades before, and theirs layered over it, generation folding into generation. "You kept adding to it," the girl said. "Someone has to," Ada answered. "Elsewise, it's just a dead man's notebook instead of a family's." She looked past her granddaughter to the door, to the dark seam of rock behind it where cold air still slipped through after all these years, faithful as ever, the same breath of stone that had once convinced a stubborn young husband there had to be something more on the other side. "There's room left in there," she said, "toward the end, for whatever you find worth setting down." The girl didn't answer right away, only ran her thumb along the journal's spine, and Ada let the quiet sit between them, easy now, not fragile. Beyond the door she could hear, faintly, the trickle of the spring channel they'd dug so long ago, still doing its patient work. "Go on in, if you like," Ada said. "Mind the low stone by the cabin door. Always did catch your grandfather's boot." She stayed where she was, the sun warm on her shoulders, and watched her granddaughter push the door open into the cool hush beyond, green and living and lit from far above, carrying forward, without knowing it yet, everything two frightened, hopeful young people had once crawled 40 feet through darkness to